My name is Barri Cohen. I'm the filmmaker, writer, director of Unloved, Huronia's Forgotten Children. I'm a middle-aged, blonde, mid-length woman with glasses, and I'm wearing a striped black and dark blue sweater. And I'm pleased to be here. My film is a documentary, and it tells the story of family members and my family and survivors from an institution that was one of the oldest in North America, but very typical in the Western world anyway, of what societies did to children considered different, and in some cases just poor and without appropriate parenting and family structures, and various children's aid societies would throw them into these institutions. And the institution was eventually called Huronia, and it's about 150 kilometers north of the city of Toronto in Canada, in Ontario, the province of Ontario in Canada. And the institution was first opened, shall we say, in 1876, and it was closed in 2009.
Thank you, Barri. That's really helpful. When you started to think about finding out more about your brothers, actually, your half brothers, when was that? What point in your life was that?
So in 2013, my sister called me one day and said, you know, there's a class action lawsuit about this place, Huronia, and, you know, you should look into it because Alfie, one of our brothers, was there. My dad had two families. He had a first marriage when he was very young at 20, and then he divorced and then married my mom in the late 50s. I was born in the 60s. But Adele, my sister, she was from that first marriage. We were relatively close. And in that first marriage, there were three children. There were her and there were two brothers. So I never knew them. And anyway, so her and I were operating on the idea in 2013 that Alfie was there. And she said, maybe you can look into this and find out what it's all about. So I started doing research through the law firm that handled the class action. And it was brought by survivors of the institution, accusing the government of grotesque neglect and failure of oversight because of the harms that had befallen children who were residents of this institution: emotional, psychological, physical, sexual harms, and criminal behavior on the part of staff and counselors who were at this institution over a period of decades. And as I started doing the research, I realized that one of our brothers, his name was Louis, it wasn't clear what had happened to Louis. Our dad lied to us. My father's dead now. He had lied and said, oh, he died at home. He was only 2. He was so badly off that his organs failed and he died. But we never really inquired, well, okay, where is he? Where was he born? Because it just was like, oh, well, that all happened before we were born. And we just made assumptions that he was in the, you know, the cemetery and all of that, the family cemetery or one of them. And, but as I started doing research after 2013, and it actually wasn't until 2017 that it was confirmed that in fact, Louis was sent there too at 3. So I had one brother who was sent to this institution when he was 4. And then a few years later, Louis was sent there when he was 2, and he died like, you know, a year and a half later. So that all happened relatively recently. And I only first knew about one of the brothers when I was 12 years old. So that was many, many, many years ago after he had died. So it was a lot of work to try and make as clear as possible this tangle of secrets, family members. It's confusing. So a lot of work went into trying to make that for viewers as clear as possible. But that was just kind of the opening gambit, because really the idea was always to connect up that story to the larger story of survivors and create a space in the film for survivors to really communicate for us what it was like to live and survive that place.
Absolutely. I think it's quite notable that in the film, it is very person orientated. It's, you know, it's very easy for people using a medical model to just use labels and to dismiss people within those labels. But I think it's quite notable for me that within the film, it is very person-centered, and people appear to have a lot of control over what they do and what they say and how they take part in the film. And I thought that was impressive, actually, Barry. You know, it was really cool.
Well, and one of the things I just want to point out that I did, because, you know, I'm not conventionally, you know, a disabled filmmaker, so I'm not identified immediately with that community. And there are many communities around people living with disability. And one of them is, you know, advocate, activist, supporter, you know, family member, supporter. And so what I did when I was working through the film, I would show survivors the rough cut at different stages, and also supporters who were really very knowledgeable about gaps in storytelling. And so I opened the process up very discreetly, you know, because I couldn't let the broadcaster know that, because there's always rules about documentary, and you never show the film before it's finished to participants. And I'm like, this is different. So I did, and I wanted to make sure I got it right. And is there anything you don't want me to say or edit in? Is there anything you want me to change? Are there things that you know, that are missing? And the biggest thing was everybody was like, well, you know, we were interviewed for an hour or 2 hours, and, you know, and this is everyone in the world who's ever interviewed, you know, like, well, I know it's going to be edited. So that was a whole education process too, about what does it mean to be edited? And then what does it mean to participate afterwards, to flesh out stories? So, but folks had a lot to say as I was putting it together.
I can imagine. I think that comes over very clearly as well. When you were starting to piece together the just the information, you know, put feelings to one side for the minute. But it's a very not a confused story, but it's a convoluted story, isn't it? What went on in those institutions and what went on behind the closed doors. You know, if we look at it as a society, there's a lot of implications, and I think that's something that you did actually highlight, and also used the name of the professor escapes me, the woman who wrote the book.
Right, Kate Rossiter. She wrote a book called Punishing Conditions.
Right. How did you manage to incorporate that as one aspect? Because it's a bit like a diamond, isn't it? There's so many different facets to it, to the story itself and to the film. But
yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, I'd be really interested to hear how you managed to blend it into the story so easily. I can't imagine it was an easy process.
I always, you know, I come from a bit of an academic background, and maybe that's my defense against my anger at social injustice. But the way my brain works is I always want to know, on the bigger sociological level, how did this come to be? And I always knew that when I was originally pitching the idea and going to funders about the project, and our equivalent in Canada of the BBC is the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So when I pitched it to them and I said, listen, this isn't just, I don't want this just to be a tale of this is what happened to me. That's only one level. I said, I want listeners and viewers to think about, why did we let this happen? How does this come to be? And that other love, that going up a level and sort of looking at who we are as a species almost, and certainly in our culture anyway, and sort of, and I'm only referencing Western culture. I can't speak for other cultures. I mean, that would be a very interesting, that's a whole series, and I wanted to do that and then look at, even within Western culture, what were they doing in Finland? What are they doing in Nordic countries, which is part of my heritage. And because of COVID and limitations on funding, I couldn't do that, and I wanted to do that. But anyway, so they liked that. They liked that. That was one of the reasons why they wanted to fund it. They wanted that question at least posed in the film. So how did I do that? So I knew that for audiences, I wanted them to get to know our storytellers, our participants first, so that they would have some experience of them, so that they knew what was at stake personally. Before I asked the more academic question, how did we get here? How did we end up committing millions and millions of pounds or dollars to building these places? That's a commitment. That's a political choice. It's an ideological choice. And it's based on othering. And it's based on a medical model, as you say. It's based on so many layers. So when I spoke with Professor Rossiter, and she was working on a book about this, and that's when I was able to bring her in and say, what are the conditions of possibility? What makes this possible? And I asked it of her, and I asked it also of Professor Madeline Burkhardt, who had done more of a history about it in going back to the Greeks, frankly. And I didn't want to go back that far because I only had so much time, but certainly with the growth of capitalism. And what does that mean for how a society wants to reorganize itself into so-called productive people and non-productive people? And that's where you get eugenics coming in to sort of weed people out. And there are contemporary forms of eugenics that I can speak to later that I am interested in exploring. So I knew from, because it is complicated, I knew that to lay it out very carefully after the main storytelling around the institution would give us pause to now clear our minds and open it to these questions. And I always knew I wanted to go there because my operating question was, what is it about human nature, certainly in the West, that makes us, or what are the conditions that make us turn sadistic or mean to people most vulnerable who need support to build resilience and all these wonderful things? What is it about us that makes us turn in the opposite direction and be bastards? And I knew that it wasn't personal. Like I knew there's something going on structurally in people. And yeah, there's bad apples, but that's not what the story is. That's not what's going on. Although I have to say that at Huronia, what they did after the war, after World War II, is they hired veterans, didn't really train them. Hired war veterans, probably half of whom had PTSD, to be in charge of children. Mm. What were they thinking? But anyway, so that was kind of how I I wanted to ask those questions about what are the conditions of possibility. And that's what she spells out in the film.
Yes, I mean, it's very clear concept of social constructs, isn't it? It's I think it is clear. I think it also, again, forgive me for being personal about this, but I think for myself, it lifts it above just a story about poor disabled people stuck in an institution, because there's an audience for that, as we know. I'm sure you know as well as I do. It's sort of disability porn, isn't it? It's basically where
exactly, and that's what the CBC didn't want.
No, and
I didn't
well
want
done. I mean, you've moved beyond that, and what it does, I think, my perception of it is that what happens is that rather than being just onlookers and watching and just being separate from the story, it includes the rest of us, the rest of the world. I always think of people as the rest of the world. It includes the rest of the world into taking responsibility and having to interact with the film. I think it's very powerful, Barry. I really do. It was particularly notable to me that happened.
And that's why I use language in the film about basically to say, what are we doing?
So you made a decision, didn't you? You made a positive decision, I think, probably right from the very beginning, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How did you find the survivors? How did you find the people who had come away from that?
So when I found out that, based on early research in 2014, so after the class action settled, one of the things survivors got in their negotiations was, we want to access, the buildings are still standing. They're empty. They're being used in different ways by the state right now, which is kind of awful. I mean, taxpayers are paying for the lights to be on in a place that's been closed since 2009. But the survivors demanded access to the buildings to tour them again with counseling support to deal with triggers and deal with trauma, and for their supporters and family members and academics to go through the buildings, to gather data, to be reminded of certain things, to help them with their claims process. So the settlement happened, and then they had to go through for about 6 months a claims process, which is a whole other documentary. And the government agreed. So I found out about those days when the buildings were open and we could tour. And I bought a camera myself, and I asked my sister, do you want to go? And she said, every time you go, I'm going. I want to go. So we went up 3 or 4 times. And that's what you see in the film, literally the native eye, if you will, of walking. When Adele, my sister, walks in that first time, that's not staged. That is walking in that first time on my camera. And then I met survivors on that tour and started talking to them, got permission to film with them, and everybody wanted to talk and speak. They were so thrilled. People were asking. And so that began a journey of connection, trust, building trust, friendship, and alliance, allegiance. And that's how I met them. And I discovered that there was a core group that were the most active in wanting to memorialize people who were buried without proper acknowledgement, love, markers, gravestones, people buried without names. And that became the Remember Every Name group. And then, so that's who's in the film primarily. And that's how I got to meet them and know them.
So on site, actually, isn't it?
Literally
Yeah.
on site.
Yeah.
And I had to be careful. I didn't want to just, put a camera on everybody's face. And it was important to spend a lot of time listening without a camera and just listening and being present. And it was an amazing experience. A real, it was a transformative experience, and I'm so grateful for it, and grateful for the journey of trust that happened out of that. And so they're very happy with the film and with the poster. They all have their poster, and I say they as, the group, Remember Every Name, because of the film, there's been a lot of attention on their work, which is really important. And there is a website called Remember Every Name, and you can explore further.
Thank you. We'll put
remembereveryname.ca or com or something.
Yeah, we'll make sure that's at the end of the film. We'll be including that for sure. You talked a bit about the claims and the it's financial restitution, isn't it? It's not. It's
right.
not going to be anything else. When I remember Lynchburg, Virginia, had a policy of sterilizing people who were there, the patients who were there, and I know that some institutions lobotomized people as well. Was there any evidence of that having happened at all?
So I have one little clip in the film. There was sterilization in Canada. It was legal in the Western provinces. And there was a famous film that the National Film Board of Canada made about a woman named Liliana Muir. And she took the Alberta government to court and I believe won restitution. One of our survivors in the film, one of the storytellers in the film, was literally on the verge of being sterilized, and it was not legal in Ontario. And they were going to do it, and she stopped them. She knew what was happening, and she stopped them. So there's a little clip in the film. She was fine if I mentioned her, but I decided not to. And she was okay with that, but there's a little piece of her medical record there, which is in the film in that section where I talk about sterilization. It's difficult to know. The data was very sketchy, but for sure it happened. And it probably happened more in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, but I think throughout the 60s and 70s, it was very quietly happening. And there is a researcher in the film, and her name is another Kate Viscardis, who wrote her PhD on violence in children at Huronia. And she, like violence against children, she has documented to the best of her ability, putting together the data on sterilizations. And she says it definitely happened up until the 1970s. At some point when it was not allowed. There were many things not allowed. Experimentation with drugs, not allowed. There were many things, and I point to that in the film, but who was going to call them on it? Whether it was documented in patient records or not. Government inspectors who would come in and accredit the hospital, they're looking at important things, but they weren't looking at that. They were looking at disease control. They were looking at cleanliness. They were looking at other things. And the hospital was always derelict with that. But did they go through did they do a random check of patient records to see if they were breaching the law? No. We had to piece that together.
Sure, that's another level, isn't it? It's another layer. Again, of people not taking responsibility. Collective decision makers didn't take responsibility, and they weren't challenged.
No, and I think, so the other operating thing that I knew from the beginning is that when, and we've seen this across many, many things, whether it's how elders are treated in homes, in what we call senior homes. They're not homes. The warehousing of bodies, senior homes. When we other someone, and we see it out of the Holocaust, when you dehumanize, when you other someone, it's a slippery slope to dehumanization. And when that happens, and the collective we see a human being as less than, my belief is that it then opens the door to all manner of degradations, because you don't think, the collective you, we don't think that they feel pain the same way, that they, like the separation of children from families. If a child is deemed intellectually disabled, oh, well, they're not going to feel the same way as a so-called normal child being separated from a parent. And that's bollocks, right? That's absolute garbage. And we know that, and we know that from attachment theory. We know that from all that. But my operating thesis is, when you dehumanize people, all bets are off in terms of ethics and integrity and humanity.
I think that then becomes cruel and unusual treatment, which is torture.
It is, and we have to fight it, and we have to fight it every day, and we have to take responsibility for it. This isn't in the past; it's operating now. In Canada, in Canada, we have now. We're just, I don't know what it's like in the UK. We're dealing now with medically assisted death, medically assisted suicide death. I don't like to use the S word, but it's medically assisted death for end of life, as an end of life option. Well, now they're debating opening it up to individuals who are not at the end of life. And the people living with disability activists are rightly challenging it in terms of constitutionality, because already we're seeing in Canada some individuals who want to elect to end their lives because of poverty. So not because of disability, but because of the conditions of poverty that disability, because of structural ableism, has put them in. That's outrageous. And that's a form of eugenics.
It is a form of eugenics. I completely agree with you. We have a very strong movement over here called Not Dead Yet, which is challenging on the similar sort of grounds. Okay. Actually, it comes into Parliament from time to time. It sneaks in with private members who tell terrible stories of close relatives who've had cancer and, you know, had terrible end of life experiences, and it's all very heartbreaking, but it doesn't actually look at the broader picture, you know, and also it doesn't take into account the fact that perhaps respite care, end of life care, appropriate psychological and counselling support hasn't been available.
Exactly.
And so on and so forth. Just thinking about that for a minute, how were the survivors that you talked to able to access support? Because they must have, imagine, experienced some form of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Well, one of the things that was unfortunately not negotiated was counseling for people, but there was some money left over after the class action claims were settled. And different groups came forward to offer those services to survivors. I think it's been a bit of a patchwork quilt of access. I don't think it's been easy. There are support workers in the community who have been availing survivors of some things. I don't think it was great. I don't think a number of supports, in addition to counseling and financial support and counseling, was available in a across the board way. It was very kind of patchwork. I know that Kate Rossiter had a group. She got government funding outside of the class action. She got class action storytelling money to send survivors, willing survivors across the country to speak to groups. And they found that actually very healing in many ways. But she also had, through another fund, a group put together that did counseling days with them to process stories, to process experiences, and to do creative and arts-based work around that. And out of that came a cabaret that they put together, which was really lovely. I have a quick little shot of it in the film, a couple of shots of it in the film. And that was out of a lot of the work that Kate Rossiter and her colleagues did. But leading up to that was about 2 years almost of counseling work with that core group. But there were thousands of claimants, and I don't think that a lot of them got the work that they did, nor people who were deemed nonverbal. I don't know what kinds of supports were available for them. And I think that was one of the sad parts, the disappointing parts of the settlement, was that there was no proper recognition, and there should have been some money earmarked for all survivors across the province
to take up the responsibilities under duty of care, isn't it? I mean, effectively. Correct. Yeah, for sure. That's very sad to hear. Actually, that's hard, because you said there were thousands. What sort of numbers are we talking about, Barry?
I think there were about 4,000. I'd have to double check. I think there were about 4,000 claims. The way the class action law works in Ontario, and it's far from perfect and definitely needs reform. But the way it worked was just by having been a resident, whether it was for 1 week or 10 years, you automatically were a member of the class and were a claimant. So you automatically were guaranteed of a certain, what would be the equivalent maybe of trying to do my calculation, maybe £3,000, regardless of what happened to you. And you had to opt out if you wanted to privately sue the government, or if you just didn't want to be part of anything. You had to actively opt out. So that required a lot of communication and support around that. And then from there, they created a grade scale that's quite gruesome, but they created a scale which we talk about in the film a little bit. And I believe Jim Dolmaj, who was supporting many, many claimants, he was one of the litigation guardians of the class action. He said, I believe it was about 4,000 claimants altogether. And it combined not just Huronia, but 2 other institutions. So the amount of money that was paid out was about $75 million, Canadian dollars, again, which would be, I don't know, 125, 30 pounds, million pounds.
Right.
I think something like that.
And
I don't think it's double anymore based on, it used to be double. No. In Canada, it used to be just times 2.5, and that's, I don't think it is that anymore. But.
No, sadly, that's gone out the window. But so what about the court fees and the lawyers' fees? And did that have to come out of the money as well?
Yeah, that was a big bone of contention. So out of that 75 million, I think they got, and the survivors went to court to fight it, but they got it. They were allowed to get, I think, 10%, 10 or 15% of that. And then what's left over went out as claims. And the problem with the claims process, again, highly imperfect, is that regardless of the degree of your harm, it was only going to ever be at a certain amount. So if you were harmed once or multiple times, it didn't matter. If you were just harmed once, you were guaranteed a certain amount. If you were harmed multiple times, That's it. We got nothing else. And there was no going to court to charge people individually. The saddest part was that nonverbal people, because they could not, unless they could work with communication technology to report and fill it, and they worked very hard. The claims process folks worked very hard to do this. But if you could not somehow communicate your memories of harm, you were only ever guaranteed, I think, 2,000 or 2,500. So if my brothers had survived, they were not members of the class, we got no money because they had died too early. You had to have survived up until 2007 to make a claim, even if you were harmed in the 1950s or 60s. And God forbid if your loved one was had died and you wanted to make a claim, I don't think you were going to be greatly compensated. And in those circumstances, and my brother had considered this, whether we should launch a lawsuit against the government independently for how our brothers died. And, so that, and I dissuaded him from that because after we went through, and he agreed, after we went through the medical records, we realized it would be a very difficult case to make, that neglect was covered under the class, even though our brothers were not part of the class action, and that it would be very difficult to make a claim of neglect against individuals who are long past. There would be no witnesses to speak to it. There would be no anything. And I don't think we had the stomach to go through it. It was enough just to go through making the film.
I can imagine it was very, very painful.
I think certainly, I channeled my pain into making the film. I think for my older brother, Marshall, it was painful. And then he was very glad he did it because it made him rethink what he thought his childhood was. His very early childhood, because he was born in the middle of all of this. He was born in 1956. And he thought his first few years of life were a certain way. And then to have to fold into that narrative, oh, I had a brother who was at an institution who was only a few years older than me, who was dying. And then I had another brother who died in 1973. So he had to shuffle the deck, if you will, of what his narrative, his early childhood narrative was. And that blew his mind. That kept him up for a lot of nights thinking about what was our father going through? What did my mother know? What did our mother know? What did, all these questions. Again, a sliver of that's in the film.
What support was available to you as a family?
I think each other.
Yeah.
I think we just kept talking and communicating with each other about it and sharing photos. And the film itself, they were so overjoyed and gratified that a big sort of set of mysteries in the family was more or less settled. What we keep talking about is, and what's not settled, and what even with the best therapy is never completely settled, is, our father is past, our mother is past. So those conversations can only live in the imaginary. We can't speak with them, talk to them, and ask more questions. And we did what we could with the surviving relatives. And so that's important too. But we have each other and we're very lucky. Not everybody does.
No. And my guess is that if there were 4 claimants, many multiples of that number of families who have secrets or dark places that they don't know about, but it doesn't go away, does it?
No, it becomes a wound that hopefully can heal in a way that the scar is beautiful. You know, like that Japanese concept of I forget the name, where the broken pieces are put together in a way that the brokenness can be somehow made beautiful. And by beautiful, I don't mean aesthetically beautiful, but I mean something to celebrate as part of who we are, part of our humanity, and part of a story that we tell. That can be a cautionary tale, that can be helpful for others, and that bonds us together in some kind of solidarity. That's where the beauty is.
I can see that as also, it's a sort of like another concept of essence, isn't it? It becomes essential. I'm just going to get my dog to sit down. Forgive me for a minute.
No.
Sit down. Good girl.
Luckily, my dog is afraid of stairs, and I'm upstairs, so she never comes up. I've tried to train her to come upstairs, but she's not having it.
I think it would be very difficult. Happily, I'm on one level here, but it would be difficult to keep them. We need little stair gates, I think. Yeah. Let me just settle her for a minute. Just sit down. Be a good girl. Be a good girl. Do the sitting down thing. Come on. Down, 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 down. Do the down, down. Good girl. Don't look at me like that. Just sit down. Down. I was just thinking, it sounds as if you've got an awful lot of material still. It sounds as if you've got a lot of thoughts still. What next, Barri? What's on your agenda?
It's a very good question. There are two things I'm interested in. One is I've delayed doing it, but I want to put together a podcast proposal for the CDC. It's highly competitive, so there's no guarantee, but they're open to receiving one that extends stories and gets to tell more of the unsaids and also more positive contemporary stories today and contemporary fights for alternative ways of living in intentional communities, inclusion. What are the inclusion fights going on right now and the inclusion successes? And I am interested in the contemporary fight right here in Canada around medically assisted death. And because I know there's a big fight, there's a court challenge that's coming up. It'll probably take a year or two for it to happen. But people living with disabilities is fighting it valiantly. And luckily, we have some resources in Canada that's available to fight what's called charter challenges, the Charter of Rights, the Constitution. If you want to challenge something a law that you think contravenes Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution, you can get some funding for now anyway to do that. So I trust that's a process they're going to undertake to do. And I just came from a conference in Ottawa, policy conference with two very large groups, People First Canada and Inclusion Canada, that are working really hard on a modern pillars of living well with disability, and I'm interested in the work that they're doing. So we shall see. I've encouraged them to think about making a film, and I would consult on it, but they have a lot. They've got more important things to worry about right now, but we shall see. But certainly the podcast, I'm interested in exploring further issues and questions with survivors and activists.
And of course, once the podcasts are made, they're there, aren't they? You can't erase them. I mean, there will be somewhere in the ether, right. So there'll be a record of them. So that's stronger than relying on paper records, isn't it? I'm sure you found. Actually, I'm sure you came across that in your researching. I mean, excuse me. I don't know if it's similar in Canada, but it's sort of in the UK. We seem to have done not a full circle, but we seem to be going around in a circle in relation to disability rights and independent living. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be interesting to hear some more from the survivors of the institutions that you'd managed to get together, because I think it's important not to forget. If we forget to keep our eye on the ball, if we forget to keep people accountable, if we, like the institution, if it's made into homes or houses or something like that, how could people live there? I don't know. It's happened over here. There's institutions all over the country that have been sold off by the health authorities and turned into multiple residences, luxury flats and so on and so forth, because usually the grounds are quite lovely because they were separated away from everybody else.
Exactly the same here. Exactly.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I really, really got the voiceover. I thought that was an extremely powerful part of the film, where people were saying, tear it down. It's what's the point of keeping it? Let's not pretend it didn't happen. And I thought that was really, really powerful. Mm-hmm. Well, Barri, I think we've been talking on for a wee bit now. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, I want to just thank you for this time, and so grateful that you've included the film in the festival and allowed this time to talk. It's been very interesting. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you, Barri. It's been a real treat, and we will put up the website links at the end of the film and in the enclosure part. But it's been lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much.
And I look forward to see. Do keep in touch. I want to see what's going to happen next. And remember, sort of Together 2012 is online. We are Disability Arts. If there's anything that we could do, to work alongside you or the survivors, then it would be great. Always worth thinking about and talking about.
Fantastic. That's lovely. Good.